The last flight home. Master Sergeant Elena Rodriguez thought she was making a routine estate sale purchase when she spotted the weathered 1944 Douglas C-47 Skytrain sitting forgotten behind a Nebraska farmhouse. The asking price of $8,000 seemed almost insulting for what had once been the backbone of Allied air transport operations. But beneath decades of prairie wind and neglect, hidden in sealed compartments, and tucked behind instrument panels lay evidence of missions that had never made it into official records. 6 weeks later, a formation of Air Force Thunderbirds appeared over the small town of Millfield, not for an air show, but to escort home the final crew of Operation Homeward, a classified mission that had waited 80 years for completion. This is the story of how one woman's restoration project became a race against time, revealing the unbreakable bonds of military aviation and the power of a community that refuses to let heroes disappear into history. The morning fog hung low over the Nebraska prairie when Elena Rodriguez guided her pickup truck down the gravel road toward the Kowalski farm. At 45, the recently retired Air Force maintenance chief moved with the purposeful efficiency of someone who'd spent 3 decades keeping military aircraft operational in conditions that ranged from desert sandstorms to Arctic freeze. Her calloused hands told stories of hydraulic leaks and engine overhauls, while her sharp eyes could spot structural problems that less experienced mechanics might miss entirely. The farm sat on 160 acres of rolling grassland that had been in the Kowalski family since the 1920s. Stanley Kowalski had passed the previous spring at age 89, leaving behind a widow who'd decided that maintaining the property was beyond her capabilities. The estate sale had drawn the usual mix of antique hunters and bargain seekers, but Elena was there for something specific, anything with wings that might be worth salvaging. She'd heard rumors about military surplus aircraft scattered across Midwest farms, relics from the massive aircraft production programs of World War II that had been sold to civilians after the war ended. Most were beyond economical restoration, but Elena's trained eye could sometimes identify components worth preserving for museum displays or educational programs. The C-47 sat behind the main barn like a sleeping giant, its twin engines covered by tarps that had probably been secured sometime during the Carter administration. Weeds grew through gaps in the landing gear, and the aluminum fuselage bore the kind of surface corrosion that came from decades of exposure to Nebraska weather. To most observers, it looked like an expensive pile of scrap metal waiting for the recycling yard. But Elena saw something different. The aircraft's basic structure appeared intact. The wing spars showed no obvious stress fractures, and the control surfaces, though weathered, retained their essential geometry. Most significantly, someone had taken care to seal critical openings and protect vulnerable systems before abandoning the aircraft to time and elements. "You interested in that old plane?" came a voice behind her. Elena turned to find Dorothy Kowalski, a slight woman in her 80s whose bright eyes suggested mental sharpness. That age hadn't dimmed. She wore a practical house dress and sturdy shoes that spoke of a lifetime spent managing farm responsibilities alongside her husband. "Depends on what you're asking for it," Elena replied, running her hand along the fuselage skin to check for hidden damage. "I restore vintage aircraft as a hobby. This one's pretty rough, but the bones might be salvageable." Dorothy studied Elena with the careful assessment that farm people reserve for potential buyers who might not understand what they're purchasing. "Stanley bought that thing in 1947 from some government surplus office in Omaha. Paid $1,200, which was serious money back then. Said he was going to convert it for crop dusting, but that never happened." Elena walked around the aircraft, noting details that told stories about its operational history. The paint scheme had been altered from military olive drab to civilian colors, but traces of the original markings were still visible beneath layers of prairie dust. More interesting were modifications that suggested this aircraft had been configured for specialized missions rather than standard transport duties. "Any paperwork with it?" Elena asked, knowing that documentation often proved more valuable than the hardware itself. "Stanley kept everything in the basement office," Dorothy replied. "Boxes of papers, photographs even, some kind of flight manuals. I never paid much attention to that stuff, but it's yours if you buy the plane." The negotiation was brief and straightforward. Dorothy wanted the aircraft gone before winter, and Elena's cash offer of $8,000 represented a fair compromise between salvage value and restoration potential. More importantly, Elena sensed that Dorothy respected her technical qualifications and genuine interest in preserving military aviation history. Loading the C-47 onto a flatbed trailer required careful planning and the services of a specialized aircraft moving company that Elena had worked with on previous projects. The logistics took 3 weeks to arrange, but watching the vintage transport aircraft roll through small Nebraska towns toward her restoration hangar in Kansas felt like escorting a piece of living history back to its proper home. Elena's restoration facility occupied a former crop dusting hangar on 40 acres outside Salina, Kansas. The space provided room for major aircraft projects while offering the privacy necessary for detailed restoration work that could take months or years to complete. Her previous projects had included a P-51 Mustang, a Navy F-4U Corsair, and several smaller liaison aircraft that now graced air museums across the Midwest. But the C-47 represented her most ambitious undertaking. Transport aircraft required different restoration approaches than fighters, involving complex systems integration and attention to details that affected passenger safety and comfort. The project would demand specialized knowledge about engines, hydraulics, electrical systems, and the kind of structural engineering that kept multi-ton aircraft safely airborne. The initial inspection revealed complexities that Elena hadn't anticipated. Someone had modified this particular C-47 far beyond standard military specifications, installing equipment that suggested roles, more sophisticated than routine cargo transport. The radio compartment contained mounting brackets for communications gear that exceeded normal tactical requirements. Additional fuel tanks had been installed in unconventional locations, extending the aircraft's range significantly beyond factory standards. Most intriguingly, the passenger compartment showed evidence of having been configured for missions. That required extended flight times with specialized personnel, custom seating arrangements, additional navigation equipment, and what appeared to be provisions for extended life support suggested operations that pushed the boundaries of conventional transport missions. Elena's breakthrough came during her 3rd week of disassembly. Hidden behind a panel in the cockpit, sealed in oiled cloth and protected from moisture by careful wrapping, she discovered a leather portfolio containing documents that made her breath catch, flight logs, mission briefings, and crew assignments that bore classification stamps from operations conducted between 1943 and 1945. The paperwork revealed that this particular C-47, tail number 43-15847, had been assigned to the 56th Troop Carrier Squadron, but had been detached for special operations that weren't detailed in conventional unit histories. The crew assignments showed the same 5 names appearing consistently. Across multiple classified missions, Captain James Morrison, Lieutenant Robert Chen, Flight Engineer Thomas Walsh, Radio Operator Michael Kowalski, and Navigator Anthony Santos Kowalski. Elena stared at the name, remembering her conversation with Dorothy at the Nebraska farm. Stanley Kowalski had purchased his own aircraft, the plane he'd flown during classified missions over occupied Europe. The discovery transformed her understanding of the restoration project from mechanical challenge to historical archaeology. The documents included mission summaries that painted a picture of operations conducted behind enemy lines, often in coordination with resistance groups operating in occupied territories. Supply drops to partisan units in Yugoslavia, agent insertions into occupied France, and evacuation missions that extracted Allied personnel from situations too sensitive for conventional military acknowledgement. But it was the final document in the portfolio that made Elena realize she'd stumbled onto something unprecedented. A handwritten note dated September 1945 and signed by all 5 crew members contained a promise that would reshape her understanding of military obligation and personal honor. Brothers, if this bird ever makes it back to American soil and someone finds these records, know that we made a pact here in England before our final mission. We swore that whoever survived the war would someday restore this aircraft to flying condition and complete the mission we never got to finish. Operation Homeward was supposed to bring displaced persons home from refugee camps, but the war ended before we could fly those final sorties. Someday, when the politics settle and the paperwork clears, this old girl needs to finish what we started. The people we left behind deserve that much. Morrison, Chen, Walsh, Kowalski, Santos, September 15, 1945. Elena sat in her hangar as afternoon shadows lengthened across the Kansas prairie, holding documents that connected her directly to World War II operations that had remained classified for nearly 8 decades. The restoration project had become something far more significant than preserving vintage. Aircraft. It had become stewardship of unfinished military obligations and unfulfilled promises made by men who'd risked their lives for operations that couldn't be publicly acknowledged. The research phase that followed consumed weeks of careful investigation through military archives, veteran organizations, and the kind of bureaucratic channels that Elena had learned to navigate during her Air Force career. The 56th Troop Carrier Squadron's official history mentioned routine transport, missions, and standard cargo operations, but contained no references to the classified missions documented in her discovered paperwork. However, declassified intelligence reports from the 1990s confirmed that special operations transport had been conducted by select C-47 crews working with the Office of Strategic Services, the World War II predecessor to the Central Intelligence Agency. These missions had required crews with exceptional navigation skills, mechanical reliability, and the personal courage necessary for flights deep into hostile territory. Elena's breakthrough in tracking down surviving crew members came through Dorothy Kowalski, who had maintained family records that included addresses for Christmas cards and occasional correspondence with her late husband's military friends. Michael Kowalski had died in 1998, but his widow provided contact information for relatives of the other crew members who might have information about their current status. The trail led to discoveries both heartening and tragic. Captain James Morris had died in a farming accident in 1972, but his son Robert Morrison was a retired airline pilot living in Colorado who possessed his father's complete military records and personal photographs from the war years. Lieutenant Robert Chen had passed away in 2019, but his daughter Susan Chen was a military historian working for the National Archives who had spent years researching her father's classified service. Flight engineer Thomas Walsh had died in 2015, but his grandson David Walsh was an active-duty Air Force maintenance officer who had inherited his grandfather's technical manuals and detailed notes about C-47 systems and modifications. Radio operator Michael Kowalski's records were maintained by his nephew, a ham radio operator who had preserved his uncle's wartime communications equipment and operational procedures. Navigator Anthony Santos proved to be the most elusive. Military records indicated he'd been killed in a car accident in 1963, but Elena's research uncovered discrepancies in the documentation that suggested the death certificate might have been part of a cover story for continued intelligence work. Eventually, through contacts in veteran intelligence organizations, she learned that Santos had lived until 2010 under an assumed identity, his true war record remaining classified until his death. But Santos had left behind something remarkable. His son, Tony Santos Jr., was a retired Air Force colonel who had spent his career in special operations and possessed not only his father's complete military records, but also detailed notes about Operation Homeward and the humanitarian missions that had been planned but never executed. The reunion of the crew members' families revealed the scope of what Elena had uncovered. Operation Homeward had been designed to transport displaced persons from refugee camps across Europe to new homes in Allied countries using C-47 aircraft that could land on improvised airstrips and operate in areas where conventional transport couldn't safely function. The operation had been scheduled to begin in October 1945, but political complications and changing military priorities had caused indefinite postponement. The humanitarian crisis that had motivated the mission had eventually been addressed through other means, but the crews who had trained for Operation Homeward had never forgotten their commitment to completing the mission as originally planned. "My father talked about Operation Homeward for the rest of his life," Robert Morrison confided during their first meeting at Elena's restoration hangar. He said they'd made promises to people in refugee camps, promises to bring them to safety and new lives. When the operation was canceled, he felt like they'd abandoned their responsibilities to vulnerable people who had trusted American promises. Susan Chen brought her father's personal archives, including photographs and documents that filled gaps in Elena's understanding of the classified missions. Dad never talked about the combat missions, but he always spoke about the people they were supposed to help after the war ended. He said that was the mission that mattered most, the one that would have justified all the risks they'd taken. Family members had maintained contact over the decades, gathering annually for informal reunions, where they shared stories and preserved memories of their father's wartime service. But Elena's discovery of the aircraft and the mission documents had provided the catalyst for something they'd discussed but never attempted, actually fulfilling the Operation Homeward commitment their fathers had made 8 decades earlier. The restoration work intensified as Elena realized she wasn't just rebuilding a vintage aircraft, but preparing for a mission that would honor both historical obligations and contemporary humanitarian needs. The modifications that had puzzled her during initial inspection now made complete sense. Extended fuel capacity for long-range humanitarian flights, specialized communications equipment for coordination with refugee assistance organizations, and passenger accommodations designed for transporting displaced persons rather than military cargo. David Walsh, Thomas Walsh's grandson, took leave from his Air Force duties to assist with the engine restoration, bringing both technical expertise and access to military parts suppliers who could provide components that civilian sources couldn't match. His presence added authenticity to the project while ensuring that all work met the exacting standards required for safe flight operations. Grandfather documented every modification made to this aircraft, David explained while rebuilding the starboard engine. He knew that someday someone would need to understand the specialized systems they had installed for humanitarian operations. Every change was designed to save lives and extend the aircraft's capabilities for mercy missions. Tony Santos Jr. coordinated with international humanitarian organizations to identify current refugee situations that could benefit from the kind of transport capabilities that Operation Homeward had been designed to provide. His special operations background and knowledge of global refugee crises helped identify missions that would honor his father's commitment while addressing contemporary humanitarian needs. The refugee situation today is more complex than what they faced in 1945, Santos explained during planning sessions held in Elena's hangar. But the basic need for safe transport to new homes remains the same. This aircraft can still make a difference in individual lives, which is what Operation Homeward was always supposed to accomplish. The restoration consumed 18 months of intensive work, with Elena coordinating efforts from crew members' families, volunteer mechanics, and military historians who recognized the project's significance for preserving World War II aviation history. The aircraft emerged from the process not as a museum display, but as a fully operational transport capable of conducting the humanitarian missions its original crew had planned but never completed. But it was the involvement of contemporary military aviation that transformed the restoration from historical preservation into active military recognition. Colonel Patricia Williams, commander of the 1st Special Operations Wing, had learned about Elena's project through military heritage networks and recognized its significance for honoring the legacy of special operations aviation. What Elena has discovered represents more than historical interest, Colonel Williams explained during a visit to the restoration hangar. The techniques and procedures developed by these World War II special operations transport crews influenced every special aviation mission conducted since. Their innovations in long-range infiltration, humanitarian transport, and refugee evacuation established protocols still used by Air Force Special Operations Command today. The connection between World War II classified transport operations and contemporary special aviation missions was more direct than Elena had realized. The crew of aircraft 43-15847 had helped establish operational procedures that influenced military humanitarian missions from Berlin airlift operations through contemporary refugee evacuation missions in Afghanistan and other crisis areas. Colonel Williams proposed something unprecedented: a formal military recognition ceremony that would honor the original Operation Homeward crew while demonstrating how their innovations continued to influence current humanitarian aviation missions. The ceremony would conclude with Elena flying the restored C-47 on an actual humanitarian mission, finally completing the Operation Homeward commitment that had waited 8 decades for fulfillment. The preparation for both the ceremony and the humanitarian mission required coordination with military authorities, international relief organizations, and diplomatic channels that Elena had never navigated as a maintenance technician. But the crew members' families provided connections and expertise that bridged the gap between historical preservation and contemporary operations. The breakthrough came when the State Department identified a group of Afghan refugees in temporary camps who needed transport to permanent resettlement locations, exactly the kind of humanitarian mission that Operation Homeward had been designed to conduct. The transport requirements matched the C-47's capabilities perfectly, providing an opportunity to honor historical commitments while addressing current humanitarian needs. As the recognition ceremony approached, Elena found herself overwhelmed by the scope of what her simple restoration project had become. The event would honor World War II veterans whose classified service had never received proper acknowledgement, demonstrate continuing military aviation heritage, and provide actual humanitarian assistance to people who needed safe transport to new homes. The restored C-47 sat in Elena's hangar, gleaming under work lights with the kind of mechanical perfection that came from months of detailed attention to every component and system. The aircraft bore period-correct military markings alongside contemporary safety equipment, bridging 8 decades of aviation development while maintaining authenticity to its original configuration. But more importantly, the aircraft represented completion of interrupted military obligations and fulfillment of promises made by men who had risked their lives for operations that couldn't be publicly acknowledged during their lifetimes. Elena had become the custodian of their commitment, ensuring that Operation Homeward would finally achieve its humanitarian mission. Standing in her hangar on the evening before the ceremony, Elena realized that her $8,000 purchase had become something far more valuable than a restored aircraft. It had become a bridge between past promises and present action, between historical obligation and contemporary humanitarian need, between individual initiative and institutional recognition of service that deserved honor regardless of classification levels. Tomorrow, the Air Force Thunderbirds would escort the restored C-47 on its first flight in over 70 years, carrying refugees to new homes while honoring the memory of airmen whose service had remained hidden until Elena's restoration project gave their story wings. The mission they'd planned but never completed was finally ready for takeoff. The morning of the ceremony dawned clear across the Kansas prairie, with the kind of crystalline visibility that pilots dream about for important flights. By 0800 hours, aircraft from across the region had begun, arriving at Salina Regional Airport, transforming the modest civilian facility into a temporary military aviation showcase that drew spectators from 6 surrounding states. The centerpiece of the event was Elena's restored C-47, positioned on the tarmac like a silver monument to military aviation heritage. The aircraft gleamed under morning sunlight, every rivet and surface polished to mirror brightness through months of painstaking restoration work. Period-correct military markings combined with contemporary safety equipment created a bridge between historical authenticity and modern operational requirements. But it was the human element that gave the ceremony its emotional power. Representatives from all 5 crew members' families had gathered to witness completion of their father's unfinished mission, creating a living connection between World War II service and contemporary humanitarian action. Their presence transformed the event from historical pageantry into personal fulfillment of family obligations that had waited 8 decades for resolution. Robert Morrison arrived from Colorado carrying his father's original flight jacket and navigation charts. From the European theater, items preserved through 7 decades of family stewardship. Dad would be amazed to see his old bird ready to fly again, he confided to Elena while they conducted the pre-flight inspection. But he'd be even more proud to know it's finally completing the humanitarian mission he always regretted leaving unfinished. Susan Chen brought her father's wartime photography collection, including images of refugee camps and displaced persons that provided stark visual documentation of the humanitarian crisis operation. Homeward had been designed to address. These photographs motivated my father for the rest of his life, she explained while setting up a display for ceremony attendees. He never forgot the faces of people who needed help that never came. David Walsh supervised final engine checks with the meticulous attention to detail that ran in his family, ensuring that every system met the exacting standards his grandfather had established for special operations transport. His active-duty Air Force experience provided technical credibility, while his family connection added personal authenticity to the restoration project. Tony Santos Jr. coordinated with international relief organizations to finalize arrangements for the refugee transport mission that would follow the recognition ceremony. His special operations background and understanding of humanitarian protocols ensured that the actual mission would meet both military standards and refugee assistance requirements. The ceremony began with the arrival of the Air Force Thunderbirds, 6 F-16 Fighting Falcons in pristine formation that represented the pinnacle of contemporary military aviation precision. Their presence honored both the historical significance of Elena's restoration project and the continuing legacy of military aviation innovation that connected World War II transport operations to current special operations capabilities. Colonel Patricia Williams served as ceremony commander, her remarks placing Elena's restoration work within the broader context of military aviation heritage preservation. Master Sergeant Rodriguez has accomplished something unprecedented, Williams announced to the assembled crowd of military personnel, aviation enthusiasts, and community supporters. She has restored not just a vintage aircraft, but a bridge between past obligations and present action, between historical service and contemporary humanitarian need. The formal recognition of the original Operation Homeward crew followed protocols developed for honoring classified World War II operations that had remained hidden from public acknowledgement for security reasons. Each crew member received posthumous decorations that recognized their special operations transport service, while their families accepted honors on behalf of fathers whose courage had influenced military aviation for 8 decades. The Air Medal presentations honored their classified missions over occupied Europe, recognizing flight operations that had required navigation skills, mechanical reliability, and personal courage under conditions that exceeded normal transport duties. The Distinguished Flying Cross Awards acknowledged their innovations in special operations transport that had established procedures still used by contemporary military aviation units. But it was the presentation of the Humanitarian Service Medal that connected past service to present mission, recognizing the crew's original commitment to Operation Homeward while acknowledging Elena's role in finally completing their humanitarian objectives. The medal ceremony transformed individual recognition into collective achievement, honoring both historical service and contemporary action. The refugee families who would be transported on the humanitarian mission attended the ceremony as honored guests, their presence providing tangible evidence of how past military commitments could address current humanitarian needs. 23 Afghan refugees, including children and elderly family members, would complete journeys that paralleled the displaced persons' transportation originally planned for Operation Homeward. As the ceremony concluded and Elena prepared for the historic flight, the emotional weight of what she'd undertaken became fully apparent. The restored C-47 would carry passengers whose need for safe transport to new homes exactly matched the humanitarian mission that had motivated the aircraft's original crew 8 decades earlier. The Thunderbirds formed up as escort formation, their modern fighters flanking the vintage transport in a display that bridged military aviation from World War II to the present day. The symbolism was intentional. Contemporary military aviation maintaining protective watch over humanitarian missions, while honoring the heritage that had established such operations as fundamental military obligations. Elena settled into the pilot seat that Captain Morrison had occupied during classified missions over occupied Europe, her hands finding controls that had been rebuilt to original specifications but incorporated modern safety enhancements. The aircraft responded to her touch with the solid reliability that had made the C-47 legendary among World War II aircrew, while updated systems provided contemporary navigation and communication capabilities. The takeoff role felt different from her previous test flights, weighted with historical significance and humanitarian purpose that transformed mechanical operation into mission completion. As the restored transport lifted off Kansas Prairie and climbed toward operational altitude, Elena realized she was finally fulfilling promises made by 5 airmen who had trusted that someone would eventually complete their interrupted mission. The flight to the refugee resettlement location took 4 hours, with the Thunderbird escort maintaining formation, while Elena navigated using both modern GPS systems and period-correct navigation techniques that honored the aircraft's historical procedures. The passengers, families who had fled Afghanistan and waited months in temporary camps, experienced transport to new homes aboard an aircraft restored specifically to complete humanitarian missions that had been planned but never executed in 1945. For Elena, the flight represented completion of the most significant project of her career, combining technical expertise with historical stewardship and humanitarian action in ways she could never have imagined when she first spotted the weathered C-47 behind a Nebraska farmhouse. The restoration had become a mission that honored military aviation heritage while addressing contemporary refugee assistance needs. The landing at the resettlement facility provided closure for promises that had waited 8 decades for fulfillment, while opening new possibilities for using restored military aircraft in humanitarian operations. That honored historical commitments through contemporary action. Elena's $8,000 restoration project had become a template for connecting military aviation heritage to ongoing humanitarian obligations. As the refugees disembarked and began new chapters of their lives in America, Elena understood that the real restoration hadn't been mechanical at all. She had restored faith in the idea that military commitments transcend individual lifetimes, that humanitarian obligations deserve completion regardless of political complications, and that individual action can fulfill institutional promises that might otherwise remain forever unfulfilled. The mission that Captain Morrison and his crew had planned but never completed was finally accomplished, proving that some debts can wait generations for payment, but are never truly forgotten when they're preserved by people who understand that honor demands action, not just remembrance. Operation Homeward was complete at last.